In this second part of our introduction to Near Eastern Archaeobotany, we consider the emergence of agriculture in the Fertile Crescent and the history of thought on this aspect. From the 1930s until his death in the late 1950s, Gordon Childe wrote about the Neolithic Revolution. He has defined the terms and set the direction of Neolithic research in Southwest Asia from the middle of the 20th century until today. He has been criticized, and some people have repeatedly declaimed how they have moved on in different directions, but in reality, his ideas have continued to dictate the terms of research. It is quite remarkable how little actual data there was for Childe to use when he formulated his ideas. Of course, therefore, he got some things wrong, but his ideas have exercised a quite extraordinary hold. The American archaeologist Robert Braidwood has also played a pivotal role in Neolithic research. After the Second World War, he set out to test Childe's theory in the field in Iraqi Kurdistan, Iran, and southeast Turkey. Some of his PhD students, like Frank Hole and Kent Flannery, developed their own research projects and became well-known processualists. Of course, there were also opponents among the younger generation, such as Louis Binford. It became fashionable to deride Childe and Braidwood as hopelessly subjective and unscientific. But it is interesting how much of Childe's and Braidwood's ideas was still found in the works of processual archaeologists. The knowledge on wild progenitor species of the crops used by Braidwood and others derived, of course, from botanical research of previous generations. We already heard about the contributions of evolutionary biology and geobotany to the knowledge of the origins and distribution of crop species, so this slide is just a summary of the most influential researchers and their work. The most influential idea on geographic regions of origin of crop species derives from the Russian botanist and geneticist Nikolai Vavilov and is known today as the model of geographic centers of genetic diversity. His research was the basis of what was later modified by Harlan and successors. Processual archaeology introduced new ideas to the Neolithization question, particularly starting in the 1960s. This was, of course, also related to the application of new methods and techniques. Economic aspects in their relation to the environment were considered as main impetus of subsistence change, in contrast to Childe's cultural interpretations. Kent Flannery was one of the proponents of processual archaeology and developed his model of the broad-spectrum economy, later called the broad-spectrum revolution, which includes the use of a broad spectrum of wild plant and animal species, leading in consequence to domestication. Please note the similarity of this viewpoint to the Vavilov model of the geographic centers of genetic diversity, that is, domestication centers. Experiments show that a considerable amount of wild cereals can be harvested. Such high yields may have led to intentional cultivation in response to high yields through increasing temperatures with the end of the Pleistocene, followed by storage, permanent settlement, and increasing birth rates. A number of stress models were developed in the 1970s as a combination of ecological and demographic pressure. Well-known proponents were Louis Binford and Mark Cohen. Post-processual archaeologists like Ian Hodder reverted to social models again, emphasizing the role of cultural decisions in the transition to agriculture. More recent models on the transition from the hunter-gatherer to the cultivator stage involve aspects on human perception and niche construction models. These are based on social anthropology and on evolutionary studies. In such approaches, it is frequently argued that differences of perception in modern and ancient humans bring about our probably biased understanding of how ancient humans perceive their environment and their ways of subsistence. Evolutionary studies pinpoint the role of acting individuals in shaping their optimal living conditions. Diversified approaches to the phenomenon of emerging agriculture led to very different models on how agriculture may have evolved. Starting with Gordon Childs' insinuating term of the Neolithic Revolution, the chronological and typology approach resulted in the categorization of the Epipaleolithic and Neolithic into different phases, implying leaps in human evolution or at least in human socio-cultural development. When we consider subsistence, we generally differentiate between two ways of procuring a livelihood from the natural environment. These are collection and production. This dualistic perspective evolved from Western philosophical tradition as a concept of the process of civilization, which assumes some kind of superiority over nature and in this respect detachment from it. The idea of slow and continuous changes in a mode of behavior, and in particular plant use, goes at least back to the 1980s, when David Harris published his clarifying chapter on plant use terminology, while emphasizing his concept of the evolutionary continuum of people-plant interaction. He also pinpoints that such a model is not unidirectional, which may appear logical, but in reality is often neglected in favor of models that include presumed release factors, such as demographic or climatic pressure, fulfilling the idea of the existence of a causal chain. Despite a general archaeological and historical consensus of defining stages which help in analyzing developments, we need to be aware that such concepts are indeed valuable tools in our pursuit for cognition, but do reflect Western philosophical tradition rather than ancient humans' perception. A very classical Western mindset in such models is the inclusion of changing cost-benefit parameters, such as, for example, an increasing input of human energy per unit area of land exploited for plant foods. Harris dissociates himself from such an understanding by emphasizing that despite the stages in his model are presented as sequential, it is not implied that they succeeded and replaced one another over time. Let's have a closer look on the arguments that consider differences in human perception to bias our aim in understanding the emergence of agriculture. Ethnographic research has shown that indigenous knowledge is grounded on a practical engagement with the environmental components. However, the possibility of a very different relationship between humans and the natural environment compared to modern society needs to be taken into account when considering ancient societies and their societal concepts. While the distinction between production and collection was already coined by Friedrich Engels in 1875 to differentiate human beings from animals, it was Gordon Childs who took up the distinction between collection and production to draw a line between Neolithic farmers and Paleolithic hunter and gatherers. As Ingold notes, in archaeology, the origins of humankind are investigated by searching for the evolutionary origins of human beings within nature, while the origins of food production involves the tracing of the decisive moment at which humanity transcended nature and was set on the path of history. By providing ethnographic examples, Ingold points out in his work that the idea of history as consisting of the human transformation of nature, like the ideas of nature itself and of society as an entity counterposed to nature, has a history of its own in the Western world. Ingold also provides a good example on how the different elements by which we usually differentiate between different stages in the development of agriculture are in fact interwoven. You can stop this video and read the text for grasping this example. To summarize, we have to assume that ancient peoples' perception on their subsistence behavior differed strongly from our modern Western perception. We also need to be aware that although we differentiate between collection as a hunter-gatherer behavior and production as an agriculturalist subsistence, collection of wild plant species and hunting continued as a major part of subsistence into established societies, and that production is a relatively distensible term that also may be employed to hunter-gatherers producing food from roots and other plant material. Let's turn to another recent theoretical approach that considers the transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture, niche construction theory, or shortly NCT. Organisms, through their metabolisms, activities, and choices, define and partly create their own niches. They may also partly destroy them. This process of organism-driven environmental modification is called niche construction. By transforming natural selection pressures, niche construction generates feedback in evolution, on a scale hitherto underestimated and in a manner that alters the evolutionary dynamics. Advocates of the niche construction perspective seek to develop a new approach to evolution, one that treats niche construction as a fundamental evolutionary process in its own right. This approach has become known as niche construction theory. An important insight from niche construction theory is that acquired characters play an evolutionary role through transforming selective environments. This is particularly relevant to human evolution, where our species appears to have engaged in extensive environmental modification through cultural practices. Such cultural practices are typically not themselves biological adaptations. Rather, they are the adaptive product of those much more general adaptations, such as the ability to learn, particularly from others, to teach, to use language, and so forth, that underlie human culture, and hence cannot accurately be described as extended phenotypes. Mathematical models reveal that niche construction due to human cultural processes can be even more potent than gene-based niche construction, and establish that cultural niche construction can modify selection on human genes and drive evolutionary events. There is now little doubt that human cultural niche construction has co-directed human evolution in this manner. Over the past 50,000 years, humans have spread from Africa around the globe, experienced an ice age, begun to exploit agriculture, witnessed rapid increases in densities, domesticated hundreds of species of plants and animals, and by keeping animals experienced a new proximity to animal pathogens. Each of these events represents a major transformation in human selection pressures. Recognized through genetic change in human populations, virtually all have been self-imposed. Humans have modified selection, for instance, by dispersing into new environments with different climatic regimes, devising agricultural practices, or domesticating livestock. Niche construction theory allots importance to both natural and cultural selection. The rise of agriculture is often considered in niche construction theory. For this purpose, agriculture is defined as the end mode of the plant domestication process, and in applying this definition, the process is completely dissociated from consideration of ancient human perception. However, instead of focusing on the search of an external factor that released plant domestication, niche construction theory investigates the co-evolutionary interactions that exist between humans and plants. Lawland states that with niche construction theory, plant domestication by humans is treated as a special case or as a subset of all cases of co-evolved mutualism between animals and plants. All the different activities involved in cultivation of wild species are part of the cultural niche construction processes. Phenotypic changes in wild plant taxa on their way to domestication occur as interaction with human agents and, according to Lawland, increase the fitness of the plant community, which in turn increases the yield. Increasing yields should, however, not be considered as a sign here of increased fitness, because domesticated species are no longer capable to reproduce in nature without human intervention. We may, however, still speak of a mutualistic relation between plants and human populations, by which plant domestication and human co-adaptation evolves. Lawland claims that niche construction theory is free of Aristotelian determinism, but in fact the differences between niche construction theory and causal chain argumentations is not as large as it may appear, because ecological aspects are still very central even when instead of one, two organisms or two groups of organisms are considered in their co-evolutionary processes. According to Lawland, niche construction is not a structuring of the environment per se, but has a purpose, that is, regulation of environmental variability. With respect to the origins of agriculture, the challenge for our ancestors was how best to damp out variability in the availability of food, such that they could survive in a variable and changing world. This assumption has already been discussed some decades ago in relation with the Younger Dryas impact. Another example for niche construction that includes climate change as a factor is the one by Peter Rowley-Conway and Robert Leighton. Their model assumes that all forager societies construct niches, which they do by the concentration of wild plants into useful stands, small-scale cultivation, burning of natural vegetation to encourage useful species, and various forms of hunting. These activities are collectively termed as low-level food production. According to the authors, many such niches are stable and can continue indefinitely because forager populations are generally stable. Some are unstable, but these usually transform into other foraging niches. They claim that the Epipaleolithic niche in the Near East was complex but stable, with a relatively high population density, until destabilized by an abrupt climate change. An argument which appears to be nothing more than climatic determinism. According to them, the niche was unintentionally transformed into an agricultural one, due to chance genetic and behavioral attributes of some wild plant and animal species. The agricultural niche could be exported with modifications over much of the Old World. This was driven by massive population increase and had huge impacts on local people, animals, and plants wherever the farming niche was carried. Farming niches in some areas may temporarily come close to stability, but the history of the last 11,000 years does not suggest that agriculture is an effective strategy for achieving demographic and political stability. And one more example by Bruce Smith, focusing on the management of wild plant and animal resources by small-scale pre-industrial societies. According to Smith, niche construction efforts by small-scale human societies that involve wild species of plants and animals can be categorized into a set of 6 general activities, based on the shared characteristics of the target species and similar patterns of human management and manipulation. The first category on his list is the general modification of vegetation communities. The second, broadcast sowing of wild annuals. The third, transplantation of perennial fruit-bearing species. The fourth is in-place encouragement of economically important perennials. The fifth is the transplantation and in-place encouragement of perennial root crops. And sixth is landscape modification to increase prey abundance in specific locations. Case study examples, mostly drawn from North America, are presented for each of the 6 general categories of human niche construction. The categories form the basis for a predictive model that outlines potential general principles and commonalities in how small-scale human societies worldwide have modified and manipulated their natural landscapes throughout the Holocene. However, the ideas already appear in the processualist models, and you can't help but get the impression that a new term was imposed on an old model. A more interesting construction is the one by Michelle Wollstonecraft, investigating the role of food processing in human evolution. It is generally agreed that food processing has had a role in human evolution. The specific ways that it has affected our evolution are, however, not well understood. Using a niche construction theory perspective, coupled with methodologies borrowed from post-harvest research in the plant sciences, Wollstonecraft investigates the means and mechanisms by which food processing is of evolutionary consequence. Humans and our hominin ancestors are considered to be the ultimate niche constructors, due to our ability to modify selection pressures through diverse, culturally generated and transmitted cultural means, that is, cultural niche construction. Wollstonecraft uses post-harvest methods to identify how food processing could feasibly have permitted hominins to modify their evolutionary selection pressures. Food processing is shown to facilitate access to increasing amounts of digestible nutrients and energy, as well as promoting increased dietary breadth and making possible the production of safer and more stable foods. It is argued that these advancements catalyzed related technological and ecological skills and knowledge, which together with the nutritional benefits further triggered changes in hominin brain and body, locomotory adaptations, and increased longevity, disease prevention, and juvenile survival rates. This emphasis on the role of bioaccessibility of nutrients in processed food and their role on brain development is usually not considered in niche construction models. To conclude, niche construction theory fits very well into any explanatory attempt of animal development, including humans, because it stands for a very general mutual relationship that is between manipulating individuals and their environment. It is not surprising that niche construction can be found in any human action. Or the more striking is that consequences of niche construction are not well understood. And to conclude with a quote, adaptation, as currently conceived, is a process by which natural selection effectively molds organisms to fit pre-established environmental templates. Environments pose problems, and those organisms best equipped to deal with the problems leave the most offspring. Despite the recognition that processes independent of organisms change the worlds to which populations adapt, the changes that organisms bring about in their own worlds are seldom considered in evolutionary analysis. Let's turn now in more detail on some of the historically more basic questions that bothered researchers for quite a while, and the results of which we consider today as self-evident. One of these questions was for a long time on the particular locality that is the center and, in a narrow sense, the site where domestication first appeared, because researchers thought for a very long time that plant domestication must have been invented in a particular location. Therefore, the first appearance of particular domesticates was compared for different regions in the Near East. A major finding was that, except for einkorn, most of the modern crop species seem to have multiple areas of origin within the Fertile Crescent. The map shows the areas of domestication for barley, emmer, and einkorn. While einkorn was probably only brought under domestication in the Karajada region of the northern Fertile Crescent, domesticated emmer evolved in a region close to einkorn and additionally in the central Levant, whereas barley had more than 2 areas of domestication. There are major problems of representativeness of archaeobotanical data. Regionally, only few sites are investigated, as for example in Iran. There are only 12 sites with higher sample and seed numbers that are archaeobotanically investigated. Particularly from the older excavations, only few samples with low seed finds have been analyzed. Furthermore, there are almost no continuous stratigraphic sequences from the Paleolithic to the early Neolithic, which makes the reconstruction of local developments difficult. Trends are mostly patched up from different short stratigraphies and from different geographic areas. We already discussed Epipaleolithic Ohalothu in Israel, but I show it here again as a representative example for a transitional site with a broad range of gathered plant species together with numerous wild progenitor species of modern crops. Another important but much younger site north of the Sea of Galilee is Ain Malacha. The Natufian site of Ain Malacha extends into the Younger Dryas cooling event and is like Ohalothu characterized by broad animal and plant spectra. An important aspect that can be noted for most of these sites is their ecotonous placement, that is, their location in highly diversified landscapes, enabling the mentioned broad spectra of animal and plant resources. Although the Younger Dryas event had much weaker effects on the environment in the Fertile Crescent compared to the more northern latitudes, the increased aridity nevertheless considerably modified vegetation and fauna. Abu Huraira is amongst the archaeobotanically best investigated sites. It starts shortly before the Younger Dryas. At the beginning of the Holocene, before the early Neolithic settlement starts, a probable hiatus has been noted. The rich archaeobotanical remains allow conclusions on ancient habitats. The plant taxa recovered from the site indicate the existence of park woodland with wild cereal stands and Pistacia terebinthus in some distance to the site, which was placed directly at the Euphrates, within a gallery forest and moist habitats, surrounded by diverse forms of woodland steppe, which were also rich in cereal stands and other plant resources. There are clear changes from the older to the younger layers in architecture, but also in plant components. Taxa of dry steppic habitats increase throughout time, and the amount of large seeded grasses decreases in the latest settlement phase. Shifting the look to the Eastern Fertile Crescent, Jogha Golan in Iran is one of the few tell sites investigated in this region. It has been excavated by Nicholas Conrad and colleagues from this institute in recent years and has preserved more than 5 meters of aceramic Neolithic sediment layers. The occupation starts with the end of the Younger Dryas and lasts more than 2,000 years without hiatus. All find categories were extremely rich, although they mainly derive from the deep sounding. The deep sounding comprises 12 archaeological horizons, which have been archaeobotanically sampled to investigate the trends in plant deposition. As you can see in the columns of percentages of selected taxa, there are conspicuous trends for all of them. In particular, a reduction of wild barley in the upper horizons, accompanied by an increase in wheat species. Emmer wheat occurs in its domesticated form, starting in horizon 2 upwards. The question on the exact timing of the emergence of domestication has been crucial in the past decades, as one of the major hypotheses on the reasons and triggers for domestication has been seen in the Younger Dryas event. This slide gives you an overview on the chronology of the pre-pottery Neolithic. Please note that the term pre-pottery Neolithic is a cultural one, referring to the Levant, where it has been coined through characterizing the archaeological assemblages. In the Eastern Fertile Crescent, archaeologists prefer using the term of aceramic Neolithic. Definitely domesticated species appear earliest in the PPNB, a finding that essentially goes back to Mark Nesbitt. Besides cereal chaff, there are a couple of other characteristics used to argue for agricultural practice and domesticated species. Storage of large amounts of cereals in communal buildings, such as in PPNA Jerf el Ahmar, as well as large numbers of cereal chaff, are usually considered strong indicators for cultivation. With the beginning of the PPNA, bones of domestic mice are found, as well as mice coprolites in many of these early sites. Large amounts of grinding stones and sickle blades are also indicating the systematic use of cereals. Decreasing small-seeded plants of taxa that later have not been domesticated and which are considered as low-ranked foods at the beginning of the Holocene are also interpreted as indicating starting focus on founder crops. The increase of typical wheat species, starting with the occurrence of wild cereals in the PPNA, is interpreted by some as a sign of intensification of soil management and tilling. A main problem is, however, that we don't know for sure whether a wild plant was intentionally collected or represents a weed. Beside the evolution of the tough rachis, which is indicative for domesticated cereals, the developmental transition from wild to domesticated cereals has been considered in relation with grain size increase. According to these considerations, grains of wild barley and wild wheat species increase before the development of the tough rachis, which would explain the phenomenon of a presence of large domestic type grains already at the beginning of the PPNB. Grain size increase has been related with the practice of tillage, which would give advantage to large grains when buried under soil. Evidence for an increase in grain size within PPN sites thus indicates pre-domestication cultivation, including soil processing. The duration of the domestication process has also been evaluated during the last decades, since more and more evidence had accumulated that shows that we deal with a process of several hundreds to thousands of years. The diagram shows the patched-up evidence of the slow development of domesticated plant assemblages in Near Eastern sites. Here another schematic picture of the development of domesticated species. Cultivation during the Epipaleolithic is difficult to prove, although sedentary communities and storage facilities existed, which makes starting cultivation possible. With the beginning of the PPNA, cultivation of the wild progenitor species becomes plausible. At that time, concentration on large-seeded taxa, the so-called high-ranked foods, started. Single phenotypically changed cultivars appear between 9600 and 8500 BC, but still they do not belong to fully domesticated assemblages. With the PPNB, domesticated plant species increase. Meanwhile, the Epipaleolithic evidence from Ohalo II has been reinterpreted as to showing cultivation of wild taxa. As this reinterpretation is heavily based on potential weed species, the acceptance of this interpretation is pending. However, the whole research field is changing with increasing speed due to perpetually developing technology and continuously increasing research output.